Okay, well, I'm meeting with Allan Ryan today at the annual meeting in Indianapolis. And we're just going to chat a little bit about the history of ACSM and the history of sports medicine, exercise science. You've been through most of it. One of the things that you were talking about earlier, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about, and that was the Wisconsin era.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you might talk a little bit about that. One of the things that I see as a major turning point in ACSM was the establishment of a permanent headquarters at Wisconsin.
Yeah.
And of course the role that Leonard Larson played and so forth. But another part of the Wisconsin thing, I think, was the faculty. And the number of faculty there, including yourself and Balke and Nagel and so forth, and their role in ACSM. Did Larson go there first and then bring Balke and yourself and people like that? I know you had a joint appointment.
Well, that's the way it happened, because I had been a member of the college and I'd been actively working just for myself in sports medicine, but I helped to establish a committee on sports medicine in the Connecticut State Medical Society.
Excuse me, was that before the AMA committee, Allan? Because you were chair of that as well, the AMA's committee on sports medicine. I just wondered if you had started the one in Connecticut earlier than that.
I believe that we did. The AMA committee came about partly as a result of a physician who was my mentor, really, in starting in Meriden, Connecticut. He was Dr. Thomas Murdoch, and he was a trustee of the American Medical Association. Mm-hmm. And what happened was that they had decided, as a result of a number of boxing scandals, that they should do some investigation about boxing. This was long before they got into this big controversy later on.
So it wasn't an issue of fitness.
Well,
it was boxing
for
the AMA.
It wasn't a question of fitness. It was a question of fatalities in boxing.
Okay.
So the trustees decided to appoint a committee to investigate it, and Dr. Murdoch was a member of the committee, and that was in charge of doing this. And because we had been working together, he knew of my interest in sports medicine. He knew that I had written this book, A Medical Aspect of Sports. And so he invited me to be a member of that committee. So we went around and investigated boxing for about a year and made a report on that subject. And then subsequently, on my recommendation to him, they decided to establish a committee on sports injuries. That was what it was first called.
That's right.
And I became a member of that committee, and Dr. Thorndike was the first chairman of that committee from Harvard. And then after I'd been a member of that committee for 2 years and he retired, then I became the chairman of that committee and was for a period of 8 or 10 years after that, before they had revolving chairmanships. But sometime before that committee had occurred, we had started a committee in the Connecticut State Medical Society. And we worked mostly with high schools and high school coaches to try to improve the care of the high school athlete. And as a result of both of those things, when Leonard was invited to the University of Wisconsin to become the chair of the Department of Physical Education, he decided that it was time to start doing something in sports medicine. And he found Bruno down in Oklahoma City, and he hired Bruno, and then he found me, and they asked me to come there as a consultant to tell them how to build and operate a program on sports medicine, which I did. And then after I did that, then they invited me to come and be full-time.
So you went there as a consultant first?
I went there as a consultant, and then in 1965, they decided to invite me, and I decided to leave my practice of general surgery and go there full-time at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, which I did. And I started as a assistant professor in the Department of Surgery, a assistant professor in the Department of Physical Education, a physician in the University Health Service.
Okay.
And then this eventually grew into my becoming associate professor and finally full professor in both medicine and in physical education, as well as athletic teams physician and University Health Service.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you became a team physician right away? Or?
I did right away, because they had never had a full-time team physician. They had had physicians who were working in the community and worked part-time with the athletic teams, but they never had one who was a full-time team physician. So I was the first full-time team physician there, and I think probably next to Bob Murphy at Ohio State, I was probably the second full-time team physician in the Big Ten. Bob was the first, I'm pretty sure.
Mm-hmm. How long were you there then?
I was there from 1965 till 1976.
Okay. And when did did you go from there to the physician in sports medicine?
No.
What happened?
What happened was, while I was there still at the university, Harry Brown, who worked for McGraw-Hill as a publisher, was thinking about starting a journal dealing with sports medicine. And he had met Fred Allman on a plane going somewhere, and they got talking about this. And Fred told him about me and about my connection with the AMA. So Harry came to see me at the University of Wisconsin and said, I'm thinking of starting a journal dealing with sports medicine. He said, would you be interested? I said, my only question is, what have you been waiting for? So we talked for a while, and then he eventually offered me a job as the editor of the journal, but not in-house, as out-of-house editor of the journal, which was to be published then in Minneapolis. Mm-hmm. So I agreed to this, and we started the journal while I was still working full-time at the University of Wisconsin. And we had an in-house editor who was not a physician in Minneapolis. His name was John Connors. He had a former newspaper man who had gone to work for McGraw-Hill. And so he was the in-house editor. I was the official editor-in-chief, and really the founder of the journal with Harry as the publisher. Mm-hmm. Then after this was,
I can get the dates very easily.
Yes, I forget what the date, actually, first date of the physician in sports medicine was. But then Connors continued to be the in-house editor for a while, and then he suddenly dropped dead following a tennis match. He was not he was in his his early 50s, I think. But he had had some heart trouble. He never had any major treatment for it. But he was a heavy cigarette smoker, and I think that was what did him in. So he dropped dead from this heart attack. And then the question was, well, what to do about the journal? And so we had a meeting with Harry Brown and some of the other people from McGraw-Hill, and they said, what can we do? And I said, what we can do is that I can become a full-time in-house editor. But they also were publishing postgraduate medicine, and they never had an in-house medical editor for postgrad. So I said, to make it worthwhile for you, I will become editor of both journals. Yeah. So that was agreed upon, and then in 1976 I moved from Madison and took over as editor of both journals. And then after a few years, the business got so big with both journals that we needed another editor for postgraduate medicine. We hired another, and I then continued as editor of Physician in Sports Medicine.
The Physician in Sports Medicine was really the first thing of its kind. I know about the Rice Stand newsletter and things like that. Yes,
there had been newsletters, but it was the first journal, at least in this country, which dealt exclusively with sports medicine.
And really directed towards the physicians.
Yes,
I mean, towards the clinician rather than exercise
It was
science.
not supposed to be a research journal.
Right.
It was supposed to be a journal that would familiarize physicians with what they needed to know about taking care of athletes. And I insisted from the beginning that it should be written in language that any physician could understand. And if any physician could understand it, then other people could understand it too.
How did that go? Did it take off? Did it grow quickly? Was McGraw-Hill pleased with it?
McGraw-Hill was pleased with it. The difficulty was in attracting the advertisers, because the medical companies, particularly the pharmaceutical companies that wanted to advertise in medical journals, didn't understand what sports medicine was. They had no concept of it at all. And the people representing the advertising agencies didn't either. And most of these advertising agencies were dominated by women who were not sports oriented. And so they had little idea about this, and they saw this as some frivolous pastime, you see. And we had a great job in convincing many of these agency women that it was worthwhile. They're even soliciting the pharmaceutical companies to put ads in this journal.
Did they lose money at first then, for not having advertising?
No, we didn't lose money. In fact, we made a remarkable record as far as publishing a medical journal was concerned, because we were making money even after the first 3 years. And this was unheard of. It was unheard of even in the sports field, because Sports Illustrated, do you know how many years it was before Sports Illustrated made a profit? 12 years. And here we were making money after 3 years. Sports Illustrated was so jealous of what we were doing that they threatened to sue us on the grounds of plagiarism of their concept. The lawyers from McGraw-Hill took care of that already, because that was silly.
Sure.
But after that, and they said that we were trying to copy their cover design, which we weren't at all. Our cover design was quite different from theirs. And in fact, what happened after this business was settled, they started copying our cover design. And they did this without acknowledging it at all. And then later on, when we made other design changes within the journal, they did the same thing. We were the first journal to have illustrations on the contents page. As soon as we had done that, within another year, Sports Illustrated put illustrations on their contents page. And they changed the internal design of their journal just along the same lines that we did. That wasn't all my idea, because we had good professional consultants on journal design, particularly John DeCesar, who was a real expert. And he helped us with design changes for physician and sports medicine and postgraduate medicine, which made them leading journals simply because of their attractive design. And everybody's been copying all these designs since then.
Yeah, that's a real common thing now, isn't it? Well, one of the things that I thought gave the American College of Sports Medicine quite a boost was the agreement that I assume you worked out, but you can explain it, between the physician in sports medicine and ACSM, to have a page, I think it was a page,
yes,
in each issue if they wanted it.
Yes. I started this.
I thought that was a tremendously important development to get the word out.
Yes.
They published their position stands in there and news items and things like that.
It helped the college to increase its membership, not only among physicians, but among others. Because as soon as our journal had started to circulate to physicians in the field of sports medicine, all the coaches and trainers started reading it. And then the physical educators started reading it. So pretty soon everybody was reading it. And so when they read news of the college in there and they weren't members of the college, then they wanted to join the college. So it was a very productive relationship.
Yeah, that's what I thought. One of the other things that we've talked about in the past, and I wondered if you could go back and talk a little bit about it, and that was the beginning of the Journal for the American College of Sports Medicine, Medicine, Science, and Sports. And I'm familiar, and I've written about it, about the title. mix up with Rystan.
Yeah.
And were you, you were associated with that early newsletter, I think, weren't you? Because
yes. I was a contributor to the letter, and in fact, I was the principal contributor when it started.
you had kindly sent me some of those back issues
Yes.
several years ago, which of course I still have, and I noticed that your name was in there all the time, but I could never really, it never really identified you as editor, but it seemed like you contributed quite a bit to it.
I did, and they consulted me about whatever they put in it.
Were they located in Connecticut?
They were, yes.
So they were close to you. And
That's right. They were in Stamford, I believe.
was that your idea to start that newsletter, or I know you explained about the product. It was an anti-inflammatory or
anti-inflammatory, yes.
Yeah, was that their idea then to market as a way to get the word out about their product, to start the newsletter?
They consulted me about how to familiarize physicians with the product.
Mm-hmm.
And so out of these discussions about how to do this, I told them that I thought a newsletter would be a good idea. I can't say that it was originally my idea,
Yeah.
but I supported them strongly in the idea of doing this.
Mm-hmm.
So it was partly, at least at my instigation, that they started it.
Mm-hmm.
But then, once it had appeared, they had a copyright on the title, so that we knew that when we started the physician in sports medicine, that we couldn't use sports medicine in 2 words.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't remember now who suggested that we make it 1 word, whether it was Harry Brown or John Connors or both, or whether we just all came upon it together.
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as we came upon this idea, then we checked it with the McGraw-Hill legal staff, and they said it was not an infringement on the other copyright, so we could go ahead with it.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the legal staff talked with Ristan, and Ristan agreed, so that was how it happened.
Is that how you pronounce it, Ristan? I've been always saying Rystan because I don't know, but it's Ristan then?
That's what we called it then, and that's what they called it.
Yeah, well, that I didn't know. I'm just going by the spelling. So, in the mid to late '60s, ACSM was trying to start their own journal.
Yes.
They eventually get this started. They pick a title. The title is very similar to the newsletter title. There's a threatened lawsuit. They change it. Balke becomes the editor.
Yeah.
You're at Wisconsin at the same time.
That's right.
Could you talk a little bit about the early years of the journal? And were you a section editor?
I was.
At the time?
Yes, I was.
Okay.
Yeah. The idea for the journal came about in discussions regarding the encyclopedia,
Mm-hmm.
because that was Leonard Larson's baby. He wanted an encyclopedia, and Bert Hyman supported him very strongly in that idea. So out of these discussions came the idea that that it would take a long time for the encyclopedia to get started, but in the meantime we could start to attract writers and people who could contribute to the encyclopedia by starting a journal where these ideas could be published.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how the journal really got started.
Mm-hmm. And Balke edited this out of his office at Wisconsin?
Out of his office in Wisconsin, yes.
Was his office in the stadium?
It was in the stadium. Yeah.
So the ACSM national office was also in the stadium.
Yes.
Where was your office there too, Allan, or were you located somewhere else?
Well, I had several offices, but my principal office was in the University Health Service, which was over on University Avenue.
Mm-hmm.
But I had an office in the stadium too, where I saw and examined and treated the athletes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But when I was first there, the office of the college wasn't there, because after it had left Bill Muller's office in Philadelphia,
right. It was in Michigan.
It moved to Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
And what's his
Montoy.
name? Henry Montoy
Mm-hmm.
was running the office there in Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
But then it became difficult for him to continue with that because he had a lot of other irons in the fire. So it was decided then finally to move it to Madison. I think, a good deal on Leonard's initiative.
Yeah, they basically asked Leonard to see if he could
Yes.
locate it there.
So he did. There were some empty rooms up on the 3rd floor in the stadium under the stands, and he got these rooms, and he got what amounted to a permanent assignment of these rooms, supposedly permanent assignment of these rooms. So then, when we had agreed to do this, then it was necessary to get somebody to be the executive director.
Right.
And that was when Don Hermanson was hired as executive.
Herman, yeah. Don
Herman,
Yeah.
And Don was a recently graduated physical education student, and I guess...
He was there to do a doctoral degree.
He was working for a doctoral degree.
With Leonard,
yes, yeah. So it was a very agreeable situation for him, and Don did an excellent job in helping us to organize the college and getting it going. So that office was operating upstairs. Bruno was down on the lower floor where his office was. And I was down also on a floor next to the training room, which was a little bit further around the corner. And then I had my office over the University Health Service.
I want to get back to the journal too, and I know you're leading up to it, but who were the other faculty there that you recall? I know Fran Nagel.
Fran Nagel was a principal person because he was our physiologist, really. And he was hired there to take a position which was described as exercise physiology. But he was a physiologist, if you can get the distinction.
Well, yeah, I think he had a joint appointment too, or at least one of his appointments was in the School of Medicine, wasn't it?
It was. But he wanted to get an appointment in the Department of Physiology.
Oh.
But there were great objections to that by some of the people in that department. Who is this guy? He thinks he's a physiologist, you know, he's just a guy who works with exercisers. So it took about 3 years for him to get an appointment and become a professor in the Department of Physiology, which he eventually did. In the meantime, he had an appointment in the medical school under the guise of being there to promote cardiac rehabilitation as an exercise physiologist.
How about Carl Stedefolk?
Carl was, when I came there, an assistant and later associate professor of physical education. And Carl was interested in working in the field of adapted physical education particularly. So I worked with him in that area quite a bit. And one of my responsibilities as a university health physician was to determine whether excuses that were presented by freshman students to prevent them from participating in what was then a required semester of physical education.
Yeah.
This was a requirement for everybody. And if you wanted to get out of it, you had to have a letter from your family physician saying that you were not qualified to participate in physical education because of your health. These letters were frequently written, as you probably may know, at the request of the family over the telephone without the physician ever seeing the candidate. So the department wanted to get everybody involved if they could, so they had to review all of these requests for excuse. So it became my responsibility to review all of these. And when I did, I found out that some of these young people, both young men and young women, should be capable of physical exercise if it was conducted under proper conditions. And that was when the concept of adapted physical education was just originating. So Carl and I worked together to develop a program for these students who had requested excuse, but I felt were qualified for physical education if they're done in the right conditions. So that's how we worked that out.
Oh, I see.
The qualification was eventually eliminated, so that this was at a time when we were having student protests about everything under the sun, and that was one of the things they protested about, so the university eliminated it. They thought, well, this is, if people want to do it, fine, they don't have to do it.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, we had this program, and I think it was an excellent program, particularly the students that were best served by this were the students with asthma and exercise-induced bronchospasm, because this was just coming into vogue at that time. People were beginning to understand what it was. And many of these students and their families have been brainwashed by well-meaning physicians saying, if they exercise, it'll kill them, you know? Yeah. We demonstrated not only that it wouldn't kill them, but it would make them better. And one boy that I remember particularly, who had been terrified by the idea of physical education because of the way he was brought up, when I finally persuaded him to accept it, he got so enthusiastic about it that after he'd finished his one semester, he said, "Can I take another semester?" We said, "Sure, you can take another semester." And then he became an addict to the gymnasium. He was over there every day for the rest of the time he was in school.
So it was just one semester requirement?
That was one semester requirement.
Yeah. When the journal was when MSS was getting started, and you had mentioned to me one time that you thought it was important for the college because it helped attract people.
It did, yes.
Could you elaborate on that a little bit as to how you saw that happening?
I saw that happening because although people had been working in the area that later came to be described as sports medicine, a lot of physicians were seeing athletes. Everything was sporadic in terms of the development of information. There would be an article that would appear here and there in some medical journal, but nobody knew where it would appear or even how to find it once it did. So it was mostly by word of mouth that people got the information. And what would happen would be that a physician would move into a community where they had a big high school and they didn't have any medical program in a sense, and he would find out then that there were athletes who needed some attention, and then he would come to some agreement with the school that he would be the school physician, and they would send athletes or people who had injuries over to his office. And so that was going on all the time, but there was nothing to help or guide these physicians as to what they should do. Particularly, an important issue was who would be qualified for physical examination. And the system of doing that with most schools was very spotty, and it was usually confined only to the football team, because this had the major attention in most high schools, and the people at large, and physicians as well, saw it as the chief sport that provoked a danger to the young people who were involved. Therefore, if it provoked a danger, there was some reason to find out who was at risk.
Yeah.
So football team physician examinations really were going on, but how they were being conducted was just the wish or desire of anybody who was doing it. And there was no system to it. And this also then became a problem in the high schools developing insurance, because the insurance companies, if they offered insurance to the high school against risk or hazard of sports, wanted to know how the students who were being covered were determined. So it was a combination of insurance requirements and general concern about risk that developed this, and as a result, one result, the American Medical Association Committee, of which I was a member, developed a series of standards for the physical examination of athletes. Tom Quigley, who was a member of our committee from Harvard, was a very important person in this, and he wrote what he called that time the Bill of Rights for the Student Athlete.
I remember seeing
yes,
that.
Yeah. And that was the foundation then of the recommended system of examination which we developed from our committee, and which was accepted as a standard by the college too when it started. And those things were all promulgated through the Journal of the college, as well as through the Journal of Physician and Sports Medicine.
Yeah, yeah.
A major concern was deaths in football players due to heat stroke. And at that time, coaches were not allowing players to drink water.
Yeah, I remember that.
That was absolutely out of the question from the time that practice started until time was over.
Yeah.
And players were dying like flies, literally. So both the American College of Sports Medicine and the American Medical Association got active in this thing. And through the journal, The Physician in Sports Medicine, we promoted this regularly. Beginning every spring, we started hyping this to say that be sure that your coach and your players get water during football practice and so on. And we scheduled a press conference to be held in Chicago one morning. I think it was in August, and I can't tell you what exact year it was, but this was promoted all around the country for press. And it was to be on a Friday morning. I came by plane. This was when I was still in I forget whether I was in Madison or still when I was back in Connecticut.
Oh.
I came into Chicago by plane on Thursday night, late Thursday night. I got up early Friday morning and hopped over to the building of the American Medical Association, where the conference was to be held. And there were the American Medical Association people and some of our sports medicine people, and there were no reporters there. Nobody had shown up. So, what's the matter? What's the trouble? And somebody said, did you read the newspaper? We said, no, I didn't see the newspaper. This was the day after the night on Richard Speck attacked and killed the Filipino nurses in their dormitory in Chicago.
Oh, no. No news to be found, right? Well, we can get the date now from that. I can find that out. Is that right?
Yeah. But in spite of that, we were able to go ahead and persuade coaches they really should give allow their players to have water.
Yeah.
And we went through the question of whether there were to be water breaks during practice. Coaches objected to that because they didn't want anything to break up the flow of the practice. So we said, well, don't worry about it. Just have water available on the side. Let them drop out when they want to have a drink. Go and get a drink. So we had to work through all that stuff. It took 20 years, really.
Yeah. Allan, is that when taking salt tablets with water,
yes.
Was that part of the electrolyte balance?
We got into the
question.
We got into the question of whether some of these cases of heat illness and heat stroke were due to salt deficiency. So we decided, more or less arbitrarily, without having really good physiological evidence to back it up, that it would be necessary for players to take some salt tablets to replace losses. Then later on, as we learned more about it, we found out that we were giving them salt unnecessarily, that some players were being overloaded with salt, actually, because the coaches would put out a bottle of salt tablets and just say, take some.
I remember that when I was in high school. That's why I asked you. So we all had these white pills we were taking.
So then we had to start discouraging the taking of salt pills, but tell them, the coaches, that salt should be available in solution or in tablets for them to take after practice if they needed it. And then we promoted a lot of research on heat illness, particularly in football players, and some of this was done at Ohio State, and some of it was done at the Cornell University laboratory, and a number of laboratories took up an interest in it. So we developed...
Who sponsored that, Allan, that kind of research? Or was there money for that?
I don't think there were specific grants that were made. I think that people just took the money out of their operating budgets. They didn't spend a lot of money. I know at Ohio State, the people who did it were members of the, not only the athletic department, the Department of Physical Education. They donated their time and efforts, in effect, to get it done. So,
is that was it out of that kind of research that that we get the products like Gatorade and all that kind of stuff?
They eventually developed out of that research and more research, which they did then, to find out if there were allowable amounts of electrolytes that could be included that would absorb properly and quickly enough, and whether or not glucose needed to be added or whether it didn't. And a lot of research then has developed over the years, which has eventually shown that during extended exercise, it is desirable to add amounts of glucose, certain amounts, if they have to be carefully measured, because if they're too hypertonic, then the athlete's stomach can't tolerate them. But this has all come about very gradually since then.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
So we do have not only Gatorade, there are 4 or 5 different products now, which are commonly used. And of course, as soon as athletes started to use them, then everybody wanted them.
Right. If it's good for them, it must be good for me.
Yeah.
Could you also comment a little bit about the early years of ACSM? I guess one of my questions was, did you know Joe Wolf or Hyman or Bishop or people like that, Steinhaus, before 1954? Or did you know of them? Or was their research not that well known? Do you have any? I know you didn't join the college till later. You were telling me although went to that first meeting in 1954. Did you know, have an idea of what they were trying to do at that time, or was it sort of a curiosity thing?
I didn't know, because what they were thinking about and doing was happening mostly in New York and Philadelphia.
Right.
And I was working in Connecticut, and although I was a graduate of P&S and I knew people in New York, I wasn't aware of, I didn't know Louis Bishop, for example, and I didn't know Bert Hyman, and I didn't know Joe Wolf, certainly, until after I joined the college. So when I began to know these people, and Tom Curitin, who was, Tom was such a creative and energetic person that you could run out of adjectives in trying to describe him, because he was tireless and enthusiastic and thoroughly committed to what he was doing.
Well, I always wondered why he wasn't involved in this, because he doesn't come into it until later, but he started that fitness lab at Illinois, I think in 45, 46. I've got the date. I mean, it's around that time. I mean, that's 8 years or so before this started, but he wasn't a founder, he wasn't a charter member.
I don't know for sure, but I think that his starting that was inspired by the fatigue laboratory at Harvard.
And I know Staley had an interest in it, who was the dean at Illinois and evidently hired him to come
Staley,
there.
I think, had been involved in the fatigue laboratory originally.
I don't know about that. I've never seen his name associated with it. He might have known of it.
I don't think he was a member of it, but I think he had been there and perhaps worked out there. And I think he then hired Curitin with the idea that they would start something similar there, which they did. And once Curitin was, to use the classic expression, like a dog with a bone. When he got hold of it, he held on to it and he worried it. And he was so committed to what he was doing there at Illinois that when the college was starting, I think it completely just went past him completely. But then when he found out about the college and he became involved in it, he became an enthusiastic supporter of the college. And it was an inspiration just to know Tom, whether you agreed with him or not. He had ideas that were quite different from what many people did in exercise physiology, but he was so enthusiastic that you were bound to get caught up in his enthusiasm. And it was wonderful to see all the great things that he did, and the tremendous influence that he had on the public in general in the concept, which to them, at the time he started, the concept of fitness was something that people never even thought about,
Yeah.
or I didn't know what it was.
That's right.
But he made physical fitness really two national words.
Mm-hmm.
That was a great contribution.
How did he get the word out, Allan?
By constantly writing, talking, lecturing, going around, giving demonstrations.
Yeah, he did a lot of things himself.
Did you ever see his 1 hour demonstration of continuous physical activity?
No.
He gave that all over the country. And he gave that to many people who had no idea that anybody could do anything like this. And he would get up before a big audience of people in a school auditorium or someplace, and he'd go through this 1 hour. And it would exhaust people just watching him. But once they had seen it, then they had some idea of what physical fitness was.
What was he doing this in the 40s, 50s, 60s? What?
Yeah, I would say starting right after World War II.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And I think one of the things about the early years of ACSM, which you alluded to a second ago, especially for Kurt and others, and in fact you told me about yourself, you know, once people found out about it, it seems that there was quite a time there of years, and a lot of people didn't know about it.
No, that's right.
And I suppose there wasn't really any way, they didn't have a publication or anything like that when they started to have annual meetings. And I noted one thing is that they used to meet 1 year before the AMA, and they met the next year before AFER, and then they got away from that. But they kept that up for 8-10 years or so.
The idea of meeting the week before the AMA meeting was to attract more physicians to become members.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was partly Bert Hyman's idea and Louis Bishop's idea.
Mm-hmm.
I think they promoted that a great deal.
Mm-hmm.
Joe was never a very strong AMA member person. He more or less was on his own.
Mm-hmm.
He probably belonged to AMA, but he never was a very strong promoter of it.
Yeah.
But Louis Bishop was. Louis Bishop's father, you know, had been a founder of the
New York Cardiological.
New York Cardiological Society or something like that. And he was, I think, the first president of that. And then Louis was later the president.
Yeah, and then the interesting thing was that both Bishop and Wolf were founders of the American College of Cardiology as well.
That's right.
And there's now a Bishop lecture in the American College of Cardiology.
Louis Bishop was a great person. And he was not only a fine physician, but he was a great practical exemplar of sport.
I guess he was a rackets player.
He was a national champion in squash rackets, and also in court tennis. He wasn't a champion in court tennis, but he played court tennis, and he played squash rackets and squash too. And he was a champion in doubles, a national champion in that. And then in his later years, when he wasn't able physically to play squash, which is a very demanding game anymore, he took up billiards.
Oh yeah, I remember that. Yeah, isn't that?
And he
amazing?
became a very good billiard player.
One of the things that was interesting to me is that both he and Hyman and Wolf, I found out, were studying athletes quite early on. Hyman was looking at marathon runners in the teens.
When he's still at Harvard.
So
that's where he got started, at Harvard. And Bert had the first, I believe, the first electrocardiographic machine in this country.
I've heard that before, yeah.
It wasn't a machine at that time, but it was the primitive device that Eindhoven had developed. And he got one from Eindhoven. And he had one in Boston before Paul Dudley White knew what it was.
Yeah. Well, I heard that he also, now I'm mixed up, I've got to go back and check, that either Bishop or Hyman, I think it was Hyman, invented the pacemaker.
He did.
So, I mean, we're talking about pretty mainstream, high-level cardiologists at the time. Wrote quite a few books on the topic.
As you know, when Ashton Graybill was developing the medical system for handling the first astronauts, he wanted to find out how they could reliably monitor the astronauts' heartbeats while they were in space through a single lead, and he couldn't find out how to do it. So he called up Bert on the telephone, and Bert had already done it. And Bert told him how to do it, and so that's how they got started with that. And Bert was Graybill's advisor to the development of the medical program for the astronauts. So Bert was into everything.
Yeah, yeah. And Graybill was from the Harvard Fatigue Lab,
yeah,
and had spent time there.
Do you have any of Bert's books?
I've looked at them at the library. I don't own them myself, but in doing the research on each of the founders, I went back and looked at their publications.
I have one of his books, the best one of his books, I think.
So one of the things we were talking about was, we determined it was Al Craig's idea. And,
yes.
Was he president then?
He was president, yeah.
To limit the membership
yes.
of the college?
Yes. He felt that it should never be more than 1,000 people. That would be an absolute limit on the membership, because it was his desire and that of many other academic people that it was to be essentially a society to promote education and research, but not to be a place for people just from the community who are interested in working in the field to somehow or other get involved, but that it should be primarily an academic society.
Was Al Craig a physician?
Yes.
It seems like a yeah. Well, I mean, good point. It seems like that it would be something that most physicians wouldn't be in favor to limit it, especially if they aspired to join. And I don't know what the other thing I want to ask you is about more physicians joining ACSM, but at the time, I don't have my sheet here, I forget when he was president, but I wouldn't imagine that a large percentage of physicians were members.
It seems to me that after the first, say, 5 years, when probably a majority of the members were physicians, that then more and more academics became members, and so that the number of new physicians joining wasn't very many. So the academics began to overwhelm the physicians, and they really took over the leadership positions in the society, right, because they had the time and the interest to do this, which the physicians didn't, being involved in their practices. So Al, although he was a physician in practice, was a full-time physician, I think, at the university. I don't think he'd ever been in private practice. And so he devoted a good deal of his time to research, actually. Oh, I see. Not just to medical practice. And one of the things that he was interested in, which I was also interested in at the time, and have since, as you know, published about it in my book, was about the potential for breaking records, how records occurred, and why they were broken, and what the limiting factors were on record performance. This was a major interest of Al's. And his studies of this in swimmers was one of the things that clarified for me, I think, as well as for other people who read this study, as to how records came about and what the circumstances were which allowed them to be broken.
I didn't know that about Craig.
And the principle that he was able to establish from his study of swimming records was that if there was a record for, say, the 100-yard swim, that it lasted for a while, and while it lasted, there gradually occurred a clustering of times that were close to the record time. And it was like an atomic reaction in a sense, in that when this cluster reached a certain critical level, the record would be broken to a certain extent. And then the new record would then establish another cluster, which then would eventually result in the new record forming. And this was a principle that had escaped a lot of other people who had studied records and how they occurred and when they were broken, and never thought of it in those terms. So that was Al's contribution to that study.
What, were you involved, I know you were, one of the things that was going on in ACSM in the beginning in the 70s and right through the 80s was sort of some infighting involving the journal and involving the annual meetings and involving CME,
Yeah.
and that was more physician involvement. And
Yes.
one of the things that was going on was physicians forming subgroups within ACSM and pushing for changes and so forth, which ends up results in the clinical sessions at the annual meeting, the clinical conferences, and so forth.
Well, that was partly my doing, because as our program grew and we got more and more contributions from non-physicians who were doing research, it began to overwhelm the relatively few contributions of physicians. And some physicians who had been members of the college for many years stopped going to the meetings and dropped out because they said that there wasn't anything there of practical importance to them that would interest them and would cause them to take the time from their practice to go to the meetings. And one of the papers, which was waved as a flag by protesting physicians. Do you remember the term?
I can imagine what the title might be. It probably had something to do with, you told me that once, and I forgot what it was now.
It was the temperature of a flying bat.
Is that it?
Yes.
How's this going to help me in my practice?
Yes, right. So, as a result of that, I thought that something should be done to keep physicians more actively involved. And I started to call meetings of physicians who were attending the college meeting and advertising this to non-members, saying that we were organizing a group of, a special interest group within the college to cater to the desires and needs of physicians. This was greeted with some applause by some physicians who felt this was the right thing to do, but some of the academics didn't like it at all. And they said, we think of ourselves as being one group altogether, and we don't want subgroups, and so forth. So after several years of attempting to do this against both apathy and opposition, I decided that it would be better to not attempt to do it anymore, but I still felt that there was a need for some organization to provide some kind of special qualification for physicians who were involved in this field, because it quickly became apparent that there wasn't going to be a specialty board in sports medicine.
Yeah, okay.
So I urged the establishment of a committee to study how physicians could be qualified. And the way that I thought the best way to do this without arousing too much opposition in the medical community was to establish this committee for the purpose of determining the qualifications of the sports medicine clinics, which were then being established around the country. And Henry Miller was the chairman of this committee. And what we were planning to do was to develop a set of standards for how a sports medicine clinic should be established. At that time, we had started to collect the names and addresses of these and publish them in the Physician and Sports Medicine. And we had an annual directory.
Yeah, I've used that, Alan. Let me interrupt just with a quick question. So what I heard was that Almonds in Atlanta was one of the first. Is that true? Do you have any recollection of how that went?
Yes. Whether it was the first or not, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
All I can tell you is that before there was any talk about such a thing as a sports medicine clinic, Jack Hewson was practicing sports medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And to my mind, Jack was the pioneer practitioner
mm-hmm.
in the field of sports medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And his clinic, which was a general clinic, was where athletes were welcome.
Where was this now?
Well, in Columbus, Georgia. That's where his clinic was.
How about Don O'Donoghue?
Well, Don O'Donoghue was an orthopedic surgeon who was attached to the University of Oklahoma, and he was the team physician for the University of Oklahoma.
His book didn't come out until the 60s, I know. There were 60 maybe 1960.
I would
date,
somewhere around that, yeah. So he did eventually develop a clinic, but
I didn't know if he did or not.
well, he did,
Yeah.
but it wasn't advertised outside of the state of Oklahoma as a clinic. It was, to me, it was a sports medicine clinic because it was mostly populated by athletes of the University of Oklahoma and other people involved in sports in and around Norman, Oklahoma, which is where it was.
Yeah. Did Thorndike have anything like that? He just basically worked with Harvard.
Thorndike's work was entirely restricted to Harvard athletes, and it was a clinic that was conducted at the Harvard Stadium, actually. And when Gus more or less retired from that, then Bart Quigley was the head of that.
Well,
But the question of whether Fred's Almonds was the first freestanding clinic is one that I think would be difficult to establish. In my mind, it probably was the first freestanding clinic that identified itself as a sports medicine clinic.
Tell me more about Houston. Was he an orthopedist as well?
He's an orthopedic surgeon, and I think he became interested in athletes because he'd always been active in sports himself, and particularly in hunting and riding sports. He was a great fox hunter. A great, I think, breeder as well as trainer of horses. And I think that's one way in which he got involved in it. But Jack also had, although he was an orthopedic surgeon, he really had a general practice of surgery. And so he was seeing people of all sorts in his clinic. And more of them were showing up with injuries or problems that related to their participation in sports. So he just sort of gradually slid into it. It wasn't a question of his establishing himself as a sports medicine physician.
Yeah. How did you get interested in sports medicine, Al?
Well, I came from a family on my father's side. Everybody was an athlete in my father's family. And so I grew up among athletes, and I participated in all kinds of sports.
Where was this? Where did you?
In Brooklyn, New York. And I went to a prep school, which was Polytechnic Preparatory Country Day School, a very complicated name.
Yeah, it is.
But it started because this school originally had been a training school for the Polytechnic Institute, which was really an engineering school in Brooklyn. And this school then, after it had developed to a certain point, this was downtown in Brooklyn, right near Brooklyn City Hall. And after it had developed to the point where they had a number of students, they decided to move out of the center of downtown Brooklyn and moved out to Bay Ridge. Do you know Brooklyn at all?
Not very well, no. I know the idea, though, the prep schools and the country day schools, because of some research I did on Harvard and Yale prep schools.
Yes.
So.
Well, it was a country day school.
So it was not a boarding school?
It was not a boarding school. It was a country day school, but its program was modeled on that of the English public schools,
right,
like Eton and
Harrow
and so forth. And the program was that everybody who was enrolled in that school was involved in sports activity every day of the year for every season.
Yeah.
You went with different sports for the season. And the school, which started with the 5th grade and ran through the 12th grade, all boys in the school were divided between, the school colors were blue and gray. So you were either blue or gray. And in every class, in every season, in every sport, the blues were enrolled against the grays. So you had, in the fall, you had a football team, you had a soccer team, you had a cross-country team. I think those were the 3 fall sports. And then in the wintertime, you had wrestling, basketball, swimming. We didn't have gymnastics. Wrestling, basketball, and swimming. I think those were the 3 winter sports. And then we did have ice skating too. We had 2 skating ponds. And then in the spring, it was baseball, lacrosse, track, and tennis. So this was a sports school, really.
So you were in it from the 5th grade? Did you
start
the 5th grade whole way through?
I went the whole way. And so I participated in all of these sports. And every season there was in one of the other of those sports, sometimes in 2 in one season. And as a result, I developed a familiarity and some technique with practically every sport that was common.
Yeah.
And it was ridiculous because I was the 2nd youngest in my class, and I wasn't very big, but I was playing football in the fall. Every fall, I was out there playing football. And as the other kids got bigger, I didn't get proportionately bigger. And unbelievably, I was playing in the line, and of course we played both ways at that time. I was playing in the line at tackle with guys on both sides of me who were almost twice my size. And I was getting beaten up every day. And I put up with this until my junior year. And I came home, because we were living at home and we were boarding. I came home one night, and I had taken a terrible beating that day in practice. And my head was aching from being hit in the head this way on the helmet. We were wearing these little leather helmets at that time.
Didn't do much, did they?
No, they didn't do much. And I said to my father said, "What's wrong with you?" I said, "My head's aching." He said, "Well, from what from?" And I said, "Because I got hit in the head so much playing football today." He said, "Well, that's too bad. Is it all right now?" And I said, "Well, it's getting better." And then I said to him, "I can't stand this anymore." And he said, "Well, you don't have to."
It was that easy.
Yeah. He said, "Do something else." So I did. I abruptly left the football team and started running cross country. And I wasn't very good at that, but we didn't have a very enthusiastic cross-country team, so I made the cross-country team. And then my senior year, I participated in track and cross-country. Cross-country in the fall and track in the spring. And I played basketball in the winter. I wasn't a very good basketball player either, but I played. So then when I went to college, the question is, what should you do then?
And you went to Yale?
I went to Yale.
Yeah.
So I said, I'm going to go out for track. So I did. I had not been terribly successful in track because I'd only been at it for a year and a half, and I didn't really have good coaching. And so we had, in the spring, a all-comers track event, which everybody, whether they're out for track or not, could participate. And I had thought of myself as being a middle distance runner, and so we had a half-mile event, with all-comers event, and I thought, well, at least I'm going to win this. But instead, I was beaten by a lacrosse player. that was humiliating to me. He later became a good friend of mine. He also became a physician. His name was Morley Wells. But anyway, so when I went to college, I said, I'm going to go out for track, and I'm going to go out as a runner. And I had a friend from Poly who went with me, who was a talented athlete, and he was a hurdler. So we went out together to the organization meeting for the freshmen for the track, and the track captain spoke to us, and he gave more or less a formal welcome and introduction. But the manager, the student manager of the team, was really a hellraiser, and he was a fiery talker. And after he gave us this very inspiring talk, and then he said, I will guarantee to you, he said, no matter what you think your ability is now, if you will come out and work regularly for the track team, by the time that you're a senior here, you will have won your letter. And I thought that was great, because it offered to me the prospect of really becoming a major letter winner in a major university. So I went out for track, and I worked hard at track and cross country, and I made my letter.
Good.
Yeah. Yeah. By winning the half mile against Princeton. And I was running then in college. We couldn't compete as freshmen. We competed as freshmen, but not with the varsity. But in the 3 years I was eligible for varsity, I was running with the Yale track team, not only in dual meets and in the intercollegiate meets, but also at the winter meets in New York and in Madison Square Garden.
Oh, yeah.
And I ran against some fantastic runners. I beat them.
Did you run the 880?
I ran 880, I ran a mile, even 2 miles sometimes. But I ran against legendary people like Gene Fensky from the University of Pennsylvania. I never ran against Cunningham because he had graduated out of the college ranks at that time. But I did run against Bill Bonstron, who was the greatest middle distance runner I ever saw in my life. He was fantastic. And he used to come to Yale, or we'd go to Princeton, and he would run the 800, the mile, and the 2 mile. He'd win them all. You know, he was fantastic. All in the same day, same meet. But I ran against him. I ran against Fensky. I ran against Charlie Hornbostel from the University of Indiana. A lot of great runners. So it was very inspiring to me, even to be able to run with these people. Yeah. I didn't expect to meet them. One embarrassing incident that happened was that we had a 2 mile relay team that was competing in the intercollegiates in Madison Square Garden in New York. And I was running the second leg, and on the pass of the baton from the first to the second leg, the guy who passed it to me didn't quite get it in my hand. I didn't quite get hold of it. We dropped the baton. And so instead of winning that heat as we expected to, we finished last. Yeah. That was embarrassing before 12,000 people or something like that to drop the baton.
When you went to med school, I assume there was no part of it dealt with sports medicine.
No.
What did you do your internship in and residency and so forth? Surgery or how did you? Was there any mechanism to?
I should say, a little bit more about my family background. My father was a surgeon.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes,
I was going to ask you that a while ago when you we're talking about your head.
He was a
Oh,
surgeon.
okay.
And I had an uncle who was also a surgeon. I had another cousin who was a physician who was in Toronto, because my family had come from Canada. My father's family came from Canada. So there were three physicians ahead of me in the family. So I decided...
Did your father go to Yale?
No, he was a graduate of McGill University.
Oh, yeah. So was Mackenzie.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So, because my father was a surgeon, I decided I wanted to become a surgeon. And he encouraged me in this. And so, when I went through medical school, I did this always with the orientation of the fact that I was going to go into surgery.
Mm-hmm.
So, when it came time to select internships, this was before the matching program started.
Right.
And people just applied anywhere where they could go. And I applied to, I think, 5 different programs and went and was interviewed for them. But the one that attracted me most was one that was, at that time, Kings County Hospital in Brooklyn. It subsequently became part of what is now called the Downstate Medical Center, but at that time it was King County Hospital. Mm-hmm. And next to the New York University Hospital, Bellevue, next to Bellevue, it was the second largest hospital in terms of numbers of patients that had work that was done. In the whole eastern part of the country, and I think the only one that was larger was Cook County in Chicago. So that attracted me, and they offered a program there, which was a 2-year program, a 2-year internship, and it was what was that time was called a mixed internship, because the first year was in medicine, general medicine. The second half year was in obstetrics and gynecology, and the other half of that year was in surgery. So that attracted me. And so I joined that program. And then, as a result of that program, I wanted to go on to a assistant residency in surgery. And also, I was offered the opportunity to go into industrial medicine at the University of Pittsburgh, I think it was. They had a program in connection with Mellon or Carnegie. Mm-hmm. So I was torn between these two, but then another thing came up which made it possible for me to earn a little bit of money. At that time, in internships, do you know what the intern got?
No idea.
$12 a month. Well, you got room and board, but $12 a month, that was all the money you got. So I didn't have any money. And my father had retired from practice at that time, so he wasn't able to give me very much, and I needed to earn some money. And so an opportunity came up for me to conduct a 1-year fellowship in surgery and wound healing. And this was sponsored by a company that had developed a new product to assist wound healing, which was a trivalent form of iodine. Iodine is I2, you know. This was I3. Mm-hmm. And the difference was that I2, although it's a powerful antiseptic, is toxic to tissue. I3 isn't, and was well tolerated by tissue. So this company had developed this product, and my research program revolved around testing this problem on wound healing, on healing infected wounds particularly. Mm-hmm. And we had plenty of infected wounds, believe me, at that hospital. Mm-hmm. So this gave me an opportunity to earn some money and also to get married, because while I was still in medical school, I met my prospective wife, and she didn't have any money either. And she was still, then when I started my internship, she was still finishing her nursing school. But then this job also offered an appointment for a nurse to assist me as the fellow, and so we took the job and got married.
Fantastic.
And so then, while I was doing this, then I applied for an assistant residency in surgery at the New Haven Hospital, and I was accepted there. So after I finished the fellowship, I went to New Haven Hospital, and then I had an assistant residency in surgery for 2 years. And then I needed to get a residency in surgery, and I decided not to do it at the New Haven Hospital because things were at 6s and 7s there. This was still during the war, and a lot of the faculty had gone off on overseas units and so forth, and things were pretty much running themselves. When I had 6 months on neurosurgery, and while I was doing that, I was running the department of neurosurgery virtually because the professor was overseas, and the guy who was taking over from him as assistant professor wasn't really very much interested in what he was doing. He was more or less interested in other outside things. So I was running the department of neurosurgery. So I applied for a residency at what was then Long Island College Hospital in Brooklyn. That now is also part of Downstate Medical Center. But it was at that time a private hospital, and it attracted me for one reason, because right in the next block to it was a hospital operated by the Sisters of the Poor of St. Francis, which was St. Peter's Hospital, and my father had been chief of surgery there. So I knew through him some of the people on the faculty at Long Island College, so I applied there for the residency, and I was accepted there. So I went from New Haven there and took the residency training in surgery. And my professor, the head of the department, was named Emil Getch. And Getch was a world-famous surgeon in thyroid surgery. He developed a reputation in doing this, so he was known all around the world. People came from all over to be operated on him. And this was a great opportunity for me to learn something I was very much interested in, working with him. And he had a reputation of being a very difficult person to work for, but I knew that I could adapt to his system of training and learn something from it, so I took the job on. And he had had some bad experiences with residents before me, and so he was a little distrustful about what was going to happen. But he knew of my father. He didn't know him personally, but he knew who my father was. He knew my father had a good reputation in Brooklyn, so that encouraged him. And so when I started working with him, he started telling me about what he was doing and so forth. He didn't tell me very much about what I was supposed to do with my staff of assistant residents and interns. He assumed that I would do something with them and that I would keep them in order and keep them busy. But he told me what he wanted to teach me about what he wanted me to do with him, because I was his assistant, really. And also, it was my responsibility to see and examine all the patients that he brought into the hospital for surgery, to examine them, prepare them for surgery, and see if they're ready for it. So I quickly learned how to do this properly to his satisfaction. And in operating with him, I got a tremendous experience in thyroid surgery, which was not available to many people at that time. And I learned to do thyroid surgery and to do it very well so that I could do it anywhere at any time. And this was a great opportunity for me to do that. But also, because of the way that that hospital operated, I really ran the surgical service under his direction. And I scheduled all the surgery that was done by all the private surgeons as well as for the ward patients. And that gave me an opportunity to learn a good deal more about surgical practice and how things were handled and managed, so that I really ran that department, and he was very pleased with what I did. One of the things that he did, always on Wednesday afternoon, he would do some surgical procedure for the house staff and the students who were there as a teaching device. And my job as the chief resident was to pick out from the patients who came in on the general ward a suitable case for him to do.
Mm-hmm.
So I did this for the first Wednesday that I was there with him, and he did the surgery and I assisted him. So on the second week, when I picked out the patient and told him what it was and so forth, he did fine. You have the patient ready and so forth. And I said yes. So when we got scrubbed up and ready to do the case, he said, "Why don't you do this?" He said, "I'll assist you."
Mm-hmm.
Wanted to see what I could do.
Mm-hmm.
So I did it, and I did it to his satisfaction. And while I was doing it, he was lecturing to the students about what we were doing and so forth. After that, I did the surgery on Wednesday afternoon, and he stood by and commented and watched it. He had complete confidence in me.
Fantastic.
So,
Well, how did you make the jump into sports?
well,
And how soon thereafter?
all right. What happened then, when I finished my residency training, during the process, during that year, I was looking for a place to go and practice. And because my family had had a place in Connecticut on the shore there in Madison for many years, which I'd been going to in the summers
Mm-hmm.
from the time I was 7 years old. I liked Connecticut, so I thought I would like to practice somewhere in Connecticut.
Mm-hmm.
And the little towns along the shore weren't big enough to support a surgical, none of them had a hospital actually. So I had to find a hospital. So I consulted a couple of people about it, and I applied to the Hartford Hospital, to the Waterbury Hospital, and to the Meriden Hospital. And when I went to the Meriden Hospital to see about this, I was interviewed by a team of the staff, and one of them was this Dr. Murdoch. And possibly because I was Irish and he was too, I think he kind of liked the idea of having an Irishman come there to practice, and because he wanted somebody. He didn't have a surgeon that he could work closely with. He had an office in a building which was a medical office building, and there was a surgeon that he'd done some work with, but the man wasn't really a very good surgeon, and he didn't have confidence. He wanted somebody else, and somebody who had newer and better training. So he encouraged me to come there, and he introduced me to other members of his little group that he had, and they all liked the cut of my jib, and so they invited me to come. So when I finished my residency training, I moved right to Connecticut and found a house sort of for myself and my wife, and I started practice there in Meriden. And he gave me great support, and because of his influence in the community, he'd been the medical chief of staff at the hospital too. A lot of people accepted me because of him, and then when I started to work there, because of my interest in sports, and people knew I was interested in sports, a lot of school athletes started coming to me. When they did this, I came to the realization that they weren't getting proper medical help and advice, and something should be done about this. And so I started to think about it, and I started to write about it, and this eventually resulted in my producing the book, which was Medical Care of the Athlete. That was my first book.
Was that, I have the book, but it was like 54, 55?
54, I think.
Yeah.
It was published by the Blakiston division of McGraw-Hill.
Isn't that interesting? Later, then you would be back with McGraw-Hill.
Yeah. My editor at that time at Blakiston division was Bill Keller. And later on, Bill Keller left McGraw-Hill and went to Yale, where he became a head librarian at Yale. So that my writing the book and publishing the book was really then sort of my launching pad that got other people familiar with the fact. And there hadn't been any book in English on sports medicine which dealt with the general practice of medicine. of sports medicine. The one book that had been written and published was by my predecessor at Wisconsin, was Walter Meanwell.
I never knew that, of course, to your article
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah.
And most people still don't know about it. But,
Well, it was published privately
yeah.
in Madison.
And of course, Thorndike's book really was a different type of book.
Thorndike's book was all about Harvard athletics and
Yeah.
the way that he organized
Yeah.
that program.
Yeah.
And because it was Harvard athletics, it was mostly about football, really.
Mhm.
That was the thing. So, and it didn't tell anything about other aspects of managing other than the prevention and care of injuries. That was all.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Dr. Heald had published a book in England
Right.
at the same time that Meanwell had published in the United States. Neither of them knew each other.
Mhm.
And Heald's book was a more general book, but it was organized. He was essentially a physical therapist. He was a physician, but his interest was in physical therapy and particularly treatment of injuries by application of electric currents. So those were two pioneering books in sports medicine, but I didn't know anything about them.
Oh, you didn't?
No,
When
at
you
that
did
time,
yours.
I did my book before I found out anything about them at all. And I thought that mine was really the first general book, and it was, because Meanwell's book, although it had some general advice about managing a team, and it was written in conjunction with New Brockney,
Mhm.
who wrote the chapter on the coach, you
Mhm.
see. And Meanwell and Rockney were good friends. And they used to conduct coaching schools during the summertime.
Right.
When they were both off from school, and they worked together, and Rockney would coach the football, and Meanwell would coach basketball.
Basketball,
And he, next to John Wooden, Meanwell was probably the most successful basketball coach in the country.
yeah. I remember reading that in your article. He had a very impressive
It
record.
was extraordinary. And among other things, he invented the Bellwoods basketball. He was a very ingenious guy. He later on became the athletic director, and at that time he got into some difficulties because he was inclined to be a little irascible. He couldn't get along well with particularly some of the football coaches. And one of the football coaches he had was one who bounced around from 6 different colleges, I think, before he finally retired. He was really a mean son of a bitch.
Mm.
And Meanwell had some difficulties with him, and so he eventually retired from the university and retired from practice. So I never got to know him personally. I did get to know his son.
Mm.
And through his son, I was able to get a copy of his book.
I was going to ask you if you had a copy.
I do.
Because I've never seen it. I've just gone by what you've written about it. You know?
I haven't, yeah.
Oh, that's great. You know, we're going to have to stop because
We've talked much too long, actually.
well, no, it's never too long. Well, we've got this thing running again, and I just wanted to continue a little bit of our discussion over the last couple of days. I'm not sure where all will lead, but or where we'll go. But one of the things that was interesting, you were telling me at lunch, was a little bit of the history of protective equipment, particularly with the football helmets. And so you think that was, I didn't ask you this, but was that the 1950s? Or
Well,
with the,
when I was in prep school, I was playing football, although it was wrong for me to be doing it, I think, because I was the second smallest, youngest in my class. I wasn't really big enough to play football, but I was playing it nevertheless. And we were playing with helmets that time, which were essentially padded felt. And so all that they would do really was just to prevent you from getting scars or perhaps bruises on your scalp. But it wasn't until I was a senior in prep school, which would be in 1932, that I first saw my first leather helmet, football helmet. And one of the boys on our school team did have a leather helmet. Then after that, when I went into college, everybody was wearing leather helmets, although they were still rather primitive.
Any padding, Alan, or just a,
They
just
had-
a covering of
They had
leather?
some,
or
they had some felt padding inside. but
just
it wasn't-
lined with that?
Yes, lined with felt.
And a chin strap? Or
A chin strap to hold the helmet in place.
nothing
yes.
on the face, though, at this
No,
time?
nothing on the
Yeah,
face.
yeah.
So it was only after I had started in medical practice and I started seeing athletes then that face masks began to appear. But first there were mouth guards, and then mouth guards, and then face masks. And the necessity for the introduction of the mouth guards and face masks was because the cost of dental repairs was going up so high that most of the high schools couldn't afford it. And when the high schools started introducing them, then gradually they came into the colleges, because when the boys had been playing with them in high school and they went to college, they more or less demanded them. The college authorities weren't too happy about introducing all that stuff.
So it was introduced at the high school level first?
That's where it became mandatory.
So a lot of the other things that I've looked at have started at the upper levels and have filtered down.
But this came from the bottom up, and it was necessary for economic reasons. It wasn't just an act of consideration for the player, but it was more consideration for covering the cost of what would happen if they didn't. And dentists began to take an interest in producing mouth protectors, mouth guards that were more effective than just the standard thing that you would buy in the drugstore and heat in hot water and mold yourself. The first state to require this equipment as mandatory was Wisconsin. And then as a result of the experience in Wisconsin, other states took it up gradually, and then the National Federation of High Schools Football Committee then decided to make it mandatory.
Well, Alan, I had a question. I remember, I have some old slides of football teams at the turn of the century, and a lot of them had nose guards. Have you seen those slides? I mean, or they're holding them in their hand, and it looked like it was just a band around the head and then this guard here. If they were used, I assume to protect from breaking your nose, I don't know,
They were.
why then didn't they use something like that when they had the helmets?
Right, because the use of the nose guard came in before there was any helmets at all.
Right.
And the reason was because line play in football at the college level in those days was mostly slugging.
Yeah, oh, I see.
And it was to prevent getting your nose broken by somebody slugging you in the face.
So then when the rule changed, even though you didn't have you had a helmet, but you didn't have a face mask,
No.
you didn't need it because it was you couldn't be belting each other in the face.
Because the style of play changed and the character of
I
play
see.
changed.
I see.
Yeah. The character of the play used to be like the character of the play in professional basketball, underneath the basket. And this is best exemplified by the statement of the player Moses Malone, who played for Philadelphia, 76ers, I believe, and also for the Washington Bullets later. And when asked about the action under the basket, Malone said, "In the paint, it's murder."
That pretty much captured it.
You know, and several of the old-time coaches who had also played football told me the same thing. They said the whole play in the line was just slugging.
So back to the helmets then. No face mask yet.
No.
You were leading
No,
through
no.
this story, but
So the helmets then were developed gradually by the helmet companies, and as much with the idea of making them attractive for the players to wear and giving them opportunities to put their high school signals and slogans on them, but with little thought really of any careful testing of what the qualities of these helmets were. They were made more for appearance and to provide coverage, but without any idea that they would be very effective. So then what happened was that with increasing numbers of players being involved at all levels in football, more injuries to the head and brain became apparent, and it was then apparent that it was necessary to do something to protect the brain if possible, and the idea was if you can make the helmet better, then you can protect the brain more. So new developments were made in the helmet, particularly in developing a suspension system inside the helmet, so that the helmet didn't fit snugly on the head just between, with the felt just between the head and the helmet. But a suspension system was developed which would disperse the force of the blow over the whole area of the head, which was an improvement. And it also helped with ventilation, because in football it played very frequently in hot and very humid weather. If you can't perspire effectively through your head, then you can develop heat stroke actually. So the improvement with the suspension system, and then with better materials becoming available, with foam rubber appearing, and then subsequently plastic foam materials, there were a lot of improvements, but because of the fatal and disabling brain injuries, lawyers began taking up the cases on behalf of the families of these players, and they decided, I don't think this was a considered decision generally, but it seemed obvious to the lawyer perhaps and to the player that if the boy had had a better helmet, that he wouldn't have had his brain injured. So they began to sue the helmet companies on the grounds that the failure of the helmet to protect the head was the cause of the brain injury, and therefore that the helmet company and probably also the school which purchased the helmet were liable. And there were suits going on all over the country. And because I had worked through the American Medical Association Committee, of which I was the chairman at that time, on medical aspects of sports, we had worked with the State High School Association and with the National Collegiate Athletic Association, and also with the NIAA at that time, to find out what could be done through the manufacturing companies to improve the helmet. And out of this came the National Operating Committee on Standards for Athletic Equipment. And this...
Late 50s, Allan?
Yes. And this provided, with the help of the testing facilities, which were made available through Wayne State University, under the leadership of Dr. Gurgen, the neurosurgeon who had been testing crash dummies for automobile companies. He then, with his associates, developed a testing method for testing the football helmet as to its efficacy on protecting the head. He also was able to use some prior experience of this, which had been developed by an engineer at Cornell University named Edward Dye, who had done the first actual testing of football helmets to determine what their response was to impact. And this resulted in the development of a test which was basically a drop test.
Oh, I see.
In which...
Rather than something hitting it.
Yeah, it was a drop because it was easier to measure the force of impact more exactly, and that's why they use a drop test. The drop test is not really very realistic in terms of what happens in football, and it ignores the fact that a more serious factor in the production of brain injury is the torque and not the direct impact force. Although some attempts have been made to develop a machine test which would reflect this more accurately, I don't think they've been effective.
Who was were the helmet manufacturers sponsoring the research?
They paid for it.
Yeah.
Yes. But of course, this was reflected in increased price of the football helmet.
Who was Rydell, one of the bigger ones?
Spalding, Rydell, McGregor. There were, at one time, I think as many as a dozen manufacturers of football helmets.
But they all end up getting sued and dropping out of the business?
Because of the enormous event, not only of developing the style of the helmet to make it unique and perhaps better than the other companies, because of the cost of replacement of helmets, because there's a big market in the reconditioning of the helmet in order to meet the National Operating Committee standards. You can't just have a helmet tested once and then use it indefinitely until it wears out. It has to be reconditioned and meet these standards periodically according to rules which have been established by the High School and College Association. So that, plus the threat of suits and having to settle some of these suits out of court to prevent going to court, drove most of the helmet companies out of business. So at the moment, I think there are only 3 companies now which actually manufacture football helmets.
And you were telling me earlier that the reason they started to put the face mask on the helmet was really to protect the teeth.
Protect the teeth, yes.
Yeah.
Because the dental bills were going out of sight.
You were also telling me earlier about your work with boxing. And one of the things, I do a little bit of this in one of my classes, and one of the things I remember in the last few years, the AMA and the American Psychological Association both came out trying to ban boxing. Well, where does all that stand now, and do you think that's ever going to take place? I don't, but
well, there is still discussion and controversy about it.
Mm-hmm.
My experience with it started before I was involved in any sports medicine association, because my mentor, when I started in surgical practice in Connecticut, was a trustee of the American Medical Association. And they had been fielding complaints from physicians and others about boxing as being a brutal and uncivilized sport and something that physicians should be opposed to rather than, rather than supporting it by providing ringside positions and so forth. So the trustees decided that...
So this was in the 40s?
Yes. This was, let me see, I started practice in 1946. It must have been 1948, I think. And so Dr. Murdoch, my mentor, was appointed chairman of a committee to study the situation in professional boxing.
Was it an AMA committee?
An AMA committee. And he appointed me as a member of this committee with 2 other physicians, and we did study the situation, among other things, by interviewing members of the, at that time there was only one controlling professional boxing association, which was, I believe, the World Boxing Association. Now they have 3 or 4 different ones, and they're always squabbling among each other. And particularly with Ernest King being a person who apparently controls all of these committees. But the result of our investigation was that we found that the regulation of professional boxing was dependent upon each state where boxing was conducted. And many states had what they called athletic commissions. Most of them were not called boxing commissions, although some had an athletic commission with a subdivision on boxing. But the states that had more regulations than any other were the states where most boxing was conducted, and that was in New York and Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Those were the three states, and we found out that the regulation of boxing through the licensing of boxing and managers was very loose, to the point of being almost non-existent in some of these states, to the point where if somebody wanted to be licensed as a manager for fighters, that he would simply call up the chairman of the commission and say, I want a license. And they'd say, come down to the office and we'll stamp you a license. There was very little regulation as to the provision of medical care for boxers, but there had been some work to introduce a better floor surface for rings, boxing rings, so that the impact of boxers hitting on to that time in just plank floors would be less, and it was a type of padded floor. It wasn't heavily padded, because if it was heavily padded, you couldn't move around on it very effectively as a boxer. That happened, and then they improved the boxing ropes, so-called, which never were really ropes. They were more steel cables.
Oh, really? Is that on the floor thing? Is that when they started putting canvas on it?
Well, they had always had canvas
over the wood,
but there was no padding with it.
Okay.
But this was a removable carpet, you might say, that you could put over and was tied down to the four ring posts.
Okay. And so then the ropes, then they had cables, and then they
continued the cables, but they started covering them with a velvet covering that covered a cushioning, because many boxers were injured just from hitting their heads on these cables. Some had suffered, in fact, fatal head injuries as a result of this. So those things were done to improve it, and the regulations with regard to the physical qualification of the boxer were rather loose, because they were required to report for examination a certain number of hours before the fight, which was principally a weigh-in, to be sure that their weight was within the limits for which the championship was announced. But sometimes there was some kind of an examination given by the physician. It was mostly just taking out his stethoscope and listening to his heart to see if it was still beating. So we reported all of that to the American Medical Association, and the result of that was, in effect, they said, well, we don't see any, although there are problems, we don't see anything that we can do about it, and we don't see any reason to attempt to promote a ban on boxing.
Do you think all those reports are still at the AMA? They're probably pretty good about
There
keeping
are
that.
probably, they must be there somewhere in the records of the Board of Trustees.
I contacted them, and I didn't know to ask them this, but they do have all the records of the committee on athletic injuries.
Yes, they do. And subsequently, then, because of renewed agitation from the public about boxing, this began maybe 10 years ago. They appointed a new committee because...
That's the stage I remember.
Yes, that was a new committee, and that was appointed principally at the instigation of the editor of the AMA Journal at that time. And he was dead set against boxing, and he wanted to kill it. And so this committee recommended to the Board of Trustees of the American Medical Association that they ban boxing, or attempt to have it banned. They also had some consideration of establishing a national control of professional boxing, taking
Rather
out the
than the
hands of the
states.
states,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
But that never got very far because all the states opposed that. And so this commission, after making the recommendation, the trustees passed on, as I recollect, they passed on the report of the committee to the annual meeting. But at the annual meeting, enough doctors objected to it as being too restrictive and without adequate evidence of what was the need for it. It was decided then to make a contract for somebody to investigate what was the actual situation and actual need. And they made a contract with Johns Hopkins University to make a study of this and to make a report. And that report was to be made this year. But so far, it hasn't appeared. There have been indications that it was going to appear, but so far it hasn't appeared.
Were you ever contacted by anyone on that new committee for any input, or?
I did have contact with the American Medical Association before that, and with the editor of this journal, and I attended several meetings which he sponsored in Chicago. And his idea, I think, was that if he could have a couple of meetings there, he could just squelch the whole thing and get rid of boxing entirely. But he had representatives there at these meetings, not only of professional boxing, but also of the United States Amateur Boxing Federation. And they were entirely opposed to a ban, of course, and they demonstrated through their experts that what they were doing to protect the amateur boxer, and that they had indeed established good rules for safe conduct of boxing and so on and so forth. And one of the members of their medical commission is a friend of mine from North Carolina, Joe Estwanick. In fact, he's been here at this meeting. He was the other day. I don't think he's still here today. But I saw him on Thursday. I think he said he had to go home on Friday. But Joe is, I think, the chairman of their medical commission of the American Boxing Federation. And he has been very insistent on tightening up the rules and regulations for the conduct of amateur boxing, but he still isn't willing to do what I've recommended to them, which is to give up the boxing helmet entirely.
For the amateurs?
For the amateur.
Why is that?
Because when you put a boxing helmet on somebody, and then you put on a glove, which weighs 8 ounces, dry, and when it's wet from all the handling that the boxers get, it can weigh as much as 16 ounces. You've given him a club to hit somebody in the head with. And if he's got a helmet on, you're going to hit him on the side of the head with the helmet. Because, two things. The helmet does have some cushioning effect locally, and the cushioning of the glove prevents you from breaking your knuckles. But if there's no helmet, and you reduce the weight of the glove, then the guy is not going to hit anybody in the head, because the minute he does, he's going to break his knuckles. So you don't have to ban blows against the head, because all you can say is, go ahead, boys, if you want, and they're not going to do it. In the days of bare knuckle fighting, there were very, very few fatalities. In 100 years of bare knuckle fighting in the United States, we only know of 1 fatality from brain injury. In 150 years of bare knuckle fighting in England, before the introduction of the Marquess of Queensberry rule, there were only 2 fatalities that we know about that occurred directly as a result of accidents in the ring.
I see.
They both involved Irishmen by a coincidence. And even more coincidental, one of the men who died subsequently from brain injury was the one who had knocked out the other one who died. Those 2 are the only ones that we know about.
Didn't Ernst Yokel write something on boxing in the Oh, I know, I shouldn't have asked you this, because I know the answer.
He did
Yeah.
publish, he did
I do.
publish a small little book like this
Yeah.
on boxing, which I have a copy. If
Do
you
you?
want to see it sometime, I have a copy of it. But it doesn't say anything substantial that would help anybody to know anything
Yeah.
really about boxing.
Was
injuries.
it you that, who was it that had something on boxing in one of the big, like Saturday Evening Post or something like that, back in the 40s maybe, or early 50s? It seemed to me that you had mentioned that to me a couple years ago, and I might be mixing it up.
Well,
Something that had a pretty big impact, and maybe that was Joe. I think it was.
he was a hound for publicity.
Yeah, I
He
think
may
it
have-
was, Allan.
I never published anything in that.
Yeah,
any of
I
those
think it was him, because he had gotten a lot of response about it.
Mhm.
Because it was in a big circulation, high circulation magazine,
Well-
something like Saturday Evening Post, I think. I think that's what it was.
There were several celebrated ringside physicians in New York City who worked mostly at, well, first, the real center of boxing at first in New York was the St. Christopher Athletic Club. And they had promoted boxing on Friday nights as an attraction for people to join the club and come to the club regularly. I think it was St. Christopher, no, St. Nicholas. So then Madison Square Garden took it on, and they started promoting fights in Madison Square Garden. One of the first promoters that was connected with the Garden was Tex Rickard.
Yeah.
And then eventually the Garden management hired promoters to work for them, and the promoters then worked with the fight managers to create the schedules of boxing at Madison Square Garden. One of the doctors who became a ringside physician for the Garden was the physician who was the chief resident in surgery when I took my first internship in surgery. John Madden, his name was. And he went into practice in New York City, whereas I moved to Connecticut. But he stayed in practice in New York City, and he got interested in boxing, and he became a ringside physician. He was also a general surgeon. But what will come out of this report from Johns Hopkins, I don't know. I don't think it will make a substantial change in anybody's opinion about this thing, because as far as I know, they haven't done any original research, and they simply gone back over old records to comb them over and see what they can find out.
I'll have to send you the reference to that article that I'm thinking about, just to make sure you've seen it, because it's just massive. I'm sure you had. It was a really extensive review of all the literature that had been written on boxing.
I have a big collection of articles on boxing, but
Yeah,
I can't
just in
keep-
case you
I
might
can't
have.
keep the catalog.
Well, I
in my
can't
head.
either. Just in case you might have missed it. That was the thing.
All right. I'd be interested in it.
But I'm sure it's the kind of thing you would have seen.
Maybe, I think I know who wrote it. It was Max Novich.
No, what? No. It's actually, Allan. It's a name that is I couldn't pronounce even if it's a long name, some kind of extremely long name in I think a Texas medical journal of some sort.
Well, Max Novich probably had more articles published in newspapers about boxing than anybody else, because he was a boxer himself, and he remained associated with the fight game, as it's called, for many years afterwards, as sometimes judge, a medical advisor to boxers. He was the physician to the Maccabee team that went to the International Maccabee Games, I don't know how many years ago. And he also then was physician to the United States Olympic team to care for boxers. And he got into trouble in the Maccabee Games because after a series of bouts, the subject of which displeased him, he slugged one of the officials. And he was thereupon barred for all time from Maccabee Games.
Oh no, where was Max located? Where geographic?
Newark, New Jersey. He's still living there. He's in poor health, he has been for years. He's had heart trouble, but the last time I heard from him, he was still alive and kicking some or other. But he generated a lot of publicity to try to promote boxing, including having banquets to develop funds to help retired or crippled boxers live and do all sorts of things like that. He had been a boxer at the University of North Carolina. That's where he went to school, where he graduated from. And then he fought some professional fights after that.